the echo of oblivion, the sister who never was. The scent of lilies and sorrow hung heavy in the air of St. Michael's Cathedral in Oakland, California. 55-year-old Catherine, a successful but solitary writer, clutched her father's arm, guiding him through the hushed reverence of her mother's funeral. Eleanor, her beloved mother, was gone. The woman who had been Catherine's anchor, her confidant, her quiet port in every storm. Now, only an aching void remained. Catherine's gaze drifted over the faces in the pews, a blur of family, friends, and colleagues, each offering a somber nod or a sympathetic glance. Her father, Richard, frail and lost in the fog of Alzheimer's, occasionally squeezed her hand, a fleeting moment of clarity in his fading world. It was a day for farewells, for quiet grief, for the stark reality of absence. Then her eyes snagged. In the third row, just behind the distant cousins, sat a woman. Unfamiliar, yet undeniably familiar. Her face was framed by dark, wavy hair, just like Catherine's used to be before she embraced the silver threads. And her eyes, those eyes, they were the exact shade of deep, contemplative blue that had haunted Catherine's own reflection for decades. The very eyes of her mother, now reflected in a stranger. A jolt, sharp and unsettling, shot through Catherine. She knew, with an almost primal certainty, that she was looking at a version of herself, a doppelganger, perhaps, or a bizarre trick of the light and her grief-addled mind. Yet the woman's gaze was direct, melancholic, and held a depth of understanding that sent shivers down Catherine's spine. It was a gaze that seemed to share her sorrow, to know her loss intimately. Catherine always knew she had a younger sister, born 2 years after her, a tiny infant who, according to her parents, died shortly after birth. A tragedy whispered, never discussed. A phantom limb of the family tree, a reason for the perpetual, quiet sadness that seemed to cling to her mother like a second skin. But this woman was alive, and her presence here at Eleanor's funeral defied every carefully constructed narrative of Catherine's life. Who was she? Why was she here? The questions roared in Catherine's mind, drowning out the gentle murmur of the priest's eulogy. The world tilted on its axis, and Catherine felt the chilling breath of a past she'd never questioned, now rising, demanding answers. The woman, sensing Catherine's gaze, offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of profound, shared understanding, before slipping away, a shadow in the grieving crowd. Chapter 1. The Haunting Gaze. The days following the funeral blurred into a haze of condolence calls, practical arrangements, and the profound emptiness of her mother's absence. But amidst the grief, one image persistently haunted Catherine, the woman in the third row. Her eyes, her profile, the uncanny resemblance. It was a question mark seared into her very soul, eclipsing even the sorrow of losing Eleanor. Catherine, usually so disciplined in her writing, found herself staring blankly at her computer screen, the words refusing to come. Her mind was a relentless loop of that woman's face, that knowing gaze. She tried to rationalize it. A distant cousin she'd never met, a remarkable coincidence, but her instincts screamed otherwise. This felt bigger, more personal, more deeply entwined with the fabric of her own existence. She began her methodical search, driven by an obsessive need for answers. She started with old family photo albums, hoping for a stray image, a forgotten face. Page after page, she saw herself, her parents, her grandparents, distant aunts and uncles, but no one resembling the woman from the funeral. No pictures of her mother pregnant with her second child. No fleeting image of the baby who supposedly died. It was as if that period of her parents' lives had been meticulously erased, a blank slate where a profound tragedy should have left scars. The official story, always delivered with a sigh and a quick change of subject, was that her sister had been born prematurely, a blue baby, and simply hadn't survived. Eleanor had been inconsolable, and Richard, her father, had been stoic, grim-faced. They never spoke of it again, not truly. It was a wound too deep to touch. But now Catherine wondered if it was a wound too deep to touch because it wasn't what it seemed. Her father, Richard, was of no help. His Alzheimer's had progressed significantly in the last year, leaving him adrift in a sea of fragmented memories. When Catherine gently tried to ask about her sister, his eyes would cloud over, his answers rambling and disjointed. "A little one, yes, a sad day. Your mother, so brave." He would trail off, lost in the labyrinth of his mind, leaving Catherine more frustrated than before. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The more she searched, the more questions arose. Why were there no death certificates, no burial records for her sister? Catherine had always accepted her parents' word. Now a cold, unsettling doubt began to creep in. She remembered her mother's melancholic nature, a pervasive sadness that seemed to deepen around a particular date each year, the alleged birthday of her lost sister. Eleanor would withdraw, spending hours gazing out the window, a faraway look in her eyes. Catherine had always attributed it to grief. Now, she wondered if it was something else entirely. Guilt? Regret? A profound longing for what could have been? One evening, while sifting through her mother's personal papers, Catherine found a small, locked wooden box at the bottom of Eleanor's cedar chest. It was similar in style to the one in her own childhood home, but smaller, more delicate. The key was tucked into a tiny velvet pouch, hidden beneath a stack of handkerchiefs. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded lace, were not photographs or letters, but two items: a tiny silvered baby's rattle, tarnished with age, and a hand-stitched sampler with the initials EK and the date October 14th, 1972. Eleanor's initials, and a date 2 years after Catherine's own birth. The alleged birth date of her deceased sister. There was also a small folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, but a faded drawing. A child's drawing, crudely sketched, of two girls holding hands, one slightly taller than the other. Below them, written in a shaky child's hand, were the words, "Me and Lizzie." Lizzie, Elizabeth. The name was a whisper in Catherine's mind, linking the drawing, the date, and the woman from the funeral. Elizabeth. The woman's name had been Elizabeth. Catherine had found her number, her address, her very identity, scribbled on a small card in her mother's rarely used Rolodex. But she hadn't dared to call. The fear was paralyzing. The need for a definitive answer, however, became overwhelming. There was one person left who might know the full truth: her Uncle Robert, her father's younger brother. He lived in a quiet town in Montana, far from the intricacies of Oakland life. But he had always been more open, more grounded than her parents, less prone to the family's deeply ingrained culture of secrecy. He was the one who, over the years, had dropped oblique hints about family matters, always stopping short of outright revelation. He was her last hope. Chapter 2: A Glimmer of Recognition. The decision to travel to Montana was made with a mixture of desperate hope and profound trepidation. The landscape shifted dramatically as Catherine drove east, from the bustling Bay Area to the vast open plains of Montana. The mountains loomed in the distance, majestic and silent, mirroring the imposing silence that had shrouded her family's past. Uncle Robert lived in a cozy cabin nestled by a tranquil lake, surrounded by towering pines. He was a man of few words, but his eyes held a quiet wisdom. Catherine with a warm embrace, sensing the unspoken weight she carried. They sat by the roaring fire, the only sound the crackling logs and the distant call of a loon. Catherine, her heart pounding, plunged straight into it. She held up the photograph of the woman from the funeral, the one she'd secretly printed from a discreet photo snapped during the service. "Uncle Robert," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you know this woman?" Robert took the photo, his weathered hands steady. He looked at it for a long moment, his gaze distant, then back at Catherine, his eyes so similar to her father's, but clearer, less haunted, held a flicker of profound sadness. "Elizabeth," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "My God, she's grown so much." Catherine gasped, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. You know her? She's real? She's my sister? She didn't die?" The questions tumbled out, urgent, desperate. Robert sighed, a deep, weary sound. He rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the serene lake. "No, Catherine, she didn't die. Not that day. Not then. Oh, Eleanor, my poor Eleanor." He turned back, his eyes full of pain. "It's a long story, Kitty, a painful one. And your mother, she carried that pain every single day of her life." He began to speak, his voice low and steady, weaving a tale that shattered Catherine's childhood certainties and painted a far more complex, tragic picture of her family. Eleanor had indeed given birth to a healthy baby girl, Elizabeth. But Catherine's paternal grandfather, a powerful, domineering, and utterly ruthless man, had been furious. He had believed that 2 daughters were a burden, that a second girl would threaten his son Richard's career and his own social standing. He had deemed it unsuitable. "Your grandfather, Frederick, was a force of nature," Robert explained, his voice grim. "A tyrant, really. He controlled everything, everyone, especially Richard. He saw Eleanor as fragile after the birth, weak, and he saw Elizabeth as an inconvenience, a stain on the family name somehow if they had 2 girls. He believed it would hold Richard back from his ambitions." He recounted the terrifying pressure Frederick had exerted. Eleanor, still recovering from a difficult delivery, emotionally vulnerable and exhausted, was no match for his relentless will. Frederick had orchestrated the adoption in secret, ensuring no records would lead back to the family. He threatened Richard, promising to disinherit him, to destroy his burgeoning law career, to sever all ties if he didn't comply and ensure the baby disappeared. "Richard, your father, he was weak, Catherine," Robert said, his voice tinged with regret, but also understanding. "He loved your mother, truly, but he was terrified of his own father, terrified of losing everything. He was caught between a monster and a deeply traumatized wife. He made a terrible choice, born of fear and misguided protection. He went along with it, hoping to protect Eleanor, hoping to save his future. He helped Frederick forge the death certificate, making it look like a stillbirth. It was an appalling deception." Robert described Eleanor's despair, her desperate pleas to keep her baby, overruled by Frederick's iron will and Richard's terrified compliance. She had been shattered, a ghost of her former self, forever marked by the forced separation from her child. She never recovered, Catherine. Not truly. That sadness you saw in her eyes, it was for Elizabeth, every single day. But she tried to find her, Robert continued, his voice softer now. Years later, when Frederick had passed, and Richard had come to terms with his shame, Eleanor began to search, secretly at first, then with Richard's hesitant help. But the records were so well hidden, so deliberately erased. They hired private investigators, spent thousands, but it was like Elizabeth had vanished into thin air. They never found her. It was Eleanor's deepest regret, her eternal torment. She always hoped, always prayed that one day Elizabeth would find them. Robert then walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. He rummaged inside, pulling out a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. "These," he said, handing them to Catherine, "are from Eleanor. She wrote to me secretly after the adoption. She couldn't tell anyone else. I was the only one she trusted with her pain. They're full of her sorrow, her longing for Elizabeth. She always knew, even when she couldn't say it out loud, that Elizabeth was out there." Catherine took the letters, her fingers trembling. Her mother's familiar, elegant script, flowing across the brittle pages, conveyed a raw, heartbreaking agony. Eleanor wrote of her profound guilt, her sleepless nights haunted by the memory of her baby's face, her desperate prayers for Elizabeth's well-being. She confessed her attempts to search, her crushing disappointment with every dead end. She wrote of the constant struggle to appear normal, to be a good mother to Catherine, while a piece of her soul remained forever lost. "She always believed you would find her, Catherine," Robert said, his eyes fixed on hers. "She told me you were strong, smart, tenacious. She always had a feeling that if anyone could uncover the truth, it would be you." Suddenly, the vague familiarity of the woman from the funeral, her poignant gaze, made terrifying, heartbreaking sense. Elizabeth, her sister, alive. The sister who hadn't died, but had been stolen. The depth of her mother's suffering and her father's complicity settled over Catherine like a shroud. Chapter 3. The Call to Connection. Back in Oakland, the revelation from Uncle Robert left Catherine reeling. The layers of deception, the enforced silence, the sheer cruelty of her grandfather's actions, and the profound, lifelong sorrow it had caused her mother, felt almost unbearable. Her carefully constructed childhood, once a picture of loving parents and a tragic but accepted loss, was now a tapestry interwoven with lies, fear, and a hidden, aching absence. She stared at the sampler, Me and Lizzie, the crude child's drawing of two girls. It must have been Elizabeth's, a poignant testament to a short, forgotten presence. And the baby rattle, a relic of a life meant to be celebrated, not erased. The next day, a text message arrived on Catherine's phone, a number she didn't recognize. The message simply read, "Catherine, this is Elizabeth, from the funeral. Can we talk? It's time." Catherine's breath hitched. Elizabeth, the woman who had haunted her thoughts, the missing piece of her life. She hadn't dared to call, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. But Elizabeth had found her. The universe, it seemed, was determined to unravel this decades-old secret. She typed back, her fingers trembling. "Yes, please, where and when?" They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in a secluded part of Berkeley, a neutral territory away from the family home. Catherine arrived early, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a woman who dealt in words, in narratives, but this story was too vast, too complex, too deeply personal for any words she knew. Elizabeth arrived precisely on time. She was even more striking up close, her features almost identical to Catherine's. yet with a subtle difference in expression, a quiet self-possession that spoke of a life lived independently, without the anchor of a known family. Her eyes, those deep, knowing blue eyes, held a mixture of nervousness and a profound weariness. They sat, facing each other across the small table, silence stretching between them. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for meeting me, Catherine. I know this must be a lot. A lot is an understatement." Catherine managed, her voice hoarse. "My uncle told me about everything, about how you didn't die." Elizabeth nodded, a flicker of pain in her eyes. "I know. My adoptive parents, they were wonderful. They told me I was adopted when I was young. They said my birth mother was a young woman who couldn't care for me, and that she wanted me to have a good life. They didn't have much information about my birth family, but I always felt this pull, this emptiness." She explained that her adoptive parents had passed away a few years prior, and in settling their affairs, she had discovered some documents they had carefully kept hidden away. Among them was a very old, almost illegible letter, slipped into a baby book from a nurse at the Denver hospital, hinting at a forced adoption and a mother's profound regret. This fragmented information had led her to a private investigator who, through painstaking work, and finally identified her birth mother as Eleanor Hayes. "When I found out Eleanor had passed," Elizabeth continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I knew I had to come, just to see, to be there. And then I saw you, Catherine, and it was like looking in a mirror. I knew instantly that you were my sister, that you were her daughter too. My mother, she searched for you, Elizabeth," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "For years, she never stopped grieving. She carried your loss every day of her life." She told Elizabeth about the baby rattle, the sampler, the hidden box, about the perpetual sadness in Eleanor's eyes. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I always wondered," she whispered, "if she loved me, if she thought about me. My adoptive parents told me she did, but it was hard to believe when you feel so discarded." "Never discarded, Elizabeth," Catherine insisted, reaching across the table to take her hand, a gesture of profound connection that felt both foreign and utterly natural. "Never. She was forced. She was trapped by her father-in-law, my grandfather." She recounted the story Robert had told her, laying bare the decades of deception, the immense pressure, the fear that had driven their parents' terrible choices. She spoke of Frederick, the patriarch, the man who had orchestrated this unspeakable act. Elizabeth listened, her face a mask of shock and dawning understanding. The pieces of her fragmented identity, the vague sense of being unwanted, suddenly shifted, replaced by a devastating but ultimately liberating truth. Her mother hadn't abandoned her out of choice. She had been a victim herself. "My father, Richard?" Elizabeth asked, her voice hesitant. Was he involved?" Catherine nodded, her gaze softening. "He was. He complied, out of fear for his own future, and misguidedly to protect my mother, who was very fragile after the birth. It was a terrible secret they both carried, and it broke them in different ways. He knows, too. He's suffering from Alzheimer's now, but he knew. Robert told me he's carried the guilt his whole life." The cafe around them faded, their world narrowing to this single, profound conversation. Two sisters, reunited after a lifetime of separation, piecing together a shared history that had been brutally torn apart before it even began. It was a story of sacrifice, of intergenerational trauma, but also of an enduring, hidden love. Chapter 4. The Letters from Eleanor. Catherine and Elizabeth spent the next few days together, a crash course in siblinghood and shared trauma. They walked for hours along the Oakland waterfront, talking. They spoke of their lives, their dreams, their heartbreaks, each discovery cementing their connection. Elizabeth, a quiet but successful artist specializing in ceramics, spoke of her childhood, loving but always with that underlying question of her origins. Catherine, the writer, found herself listening more than speaking, absorbing every detail, every nuance of this unexpected sister. But the most potent revelation came when Catherine finally showed Elizabeth the letters from Eleanor, the ones Uncle Robert had guarded for so long. They sat in Eleanor's old sunroom, the same room where Catherine had often found her mother lost in thought, gazing out at the garden. Now, Elizabeth sat in the same spot, holding the faded pages of her mother's anguish. As Elizabeth read each letter, her hand trembled. Eleanor's words painted a vivid picture of her suffering. "My dearest Robert, I cannot sleep. Every night I see her face. My little Elizabeth. How could I let them take her? How could I have been so weak? Frederick's threats, Richard's terror. I was so broken, Robert. My mind was not my own, but my heart remembers. It aches for her, every moment." Another letter, written years later, detailed Eleanor's desperate attempts to find her. The investigator said there are no leads. It's like she vanished. I pray she is safe, loved. I imagine her laughter, her tiny hands. Catherine is a beautiful girl, Robert. She fills my life with joy. But there is always a piece missing, a ghost at the table, a constant sorrow. Richard tries to make amends. He helps me search now, but the guilt is a shroud. I just want to know she's okay, just once, to see her face again. A third letter, the last one Robert had received. I feel her presence, Robert. I believe she is out there. I just know it. And I have a feeling, a strong feeling, that Catherine will find her. Catherine is tenacious. She feels things deeply. If anyone can break through this wall of silence, it's my Catherine. I just pray I live long enough to see it. Elizabeth wept, silent, profound tears. The words, pouring from her mother's heart, finally brought a sense of peace to a lifelong wound. She wasn't forgotten. She wasn't discarded. Her mother had loved her, had grieved for her, had searched for her with every fiber of her being. The forced adoption, the secrecy, the pain. It wasn't a choice, but a terrible, tragic consequence of a patriarchal society and a family's twisted sense of honor. She never stopped loving you, Elizabeth, Catherine said, her voice choked with emotion. Every single day, she never did. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but shining with a newfound clarity. She suffered so much, she whispered. And father, your father, he must have lived with unbearable guilt too. He did, Catherine confirmed. He never spoke of it, but I saw the shadows in his eyes, the way he would flinch if anyone mentioned family secrets. He loved my mother fiercely, and I think that complicity, that secret, drove a wedge between them that never fully healed, even though they stayed together. The letters from Eleanor weren't just a painful revelation. They were a profound gift. They were the ultimate validation of Elizabeth's existence, of her mother's love, and the missing piece of her own story. They allowed both sisters to finally understand the depth of their mother's quiet despair and the true cost of their family secrets. Chapter 5: The Reckoning and Reunion. The next step was uncertain. Richard, their father, was deep in the throes of Alzheimer's. Could he even comprehend what was happening? Would seeing Elizabeth, his lost daughter, bring him peace or further confusion? Catherine and Elizabeth deliberated for a long time, weighing the potential benefits against the risks. In the end, a quiet determination settled upon them. They had to try. For Eleanor, for themselves, for the man who had lived with his own unacknowledged guilt for so long. They decided to visit Richard at the assisted living facility. He was in his usual armchair, gazing blankly at the television. Catherine sat beside him, holding his hand. Elizabeth stood a little behind her, out of his immediate line of sight, her heart pounding. "Dad," Catherine said gently, "I have someone here I want you to meet." She gestured for Elizabeth to step forward. Richard's eyes, unfocused for most of the day, slowly shifted. His gaze drifted to Elizabeth, then back to Catherine, then to Elizabeth again. A flicker of something, a spark of recognition, seemed to ignite deep within their cloudy depths. His brow furrowed, as if trying to grasp a fleeting thought. Elizabeth, her voice soft, almost a whisper, spoke directly to him. "Hello, Father. It's Elizabeth." Richard's hand, which had been limp in Catherine's, suddenly tightened. His lips moved, forming silent words. Then, clearly, distinctly, in a voice that held a fleeting echo of his former self, he spoke. My little Lizzie." Catherine gasped. Elizabeth's breath caught. His eyes, though still distant, seemed to hold a profound, poignant understanding. A single tear tracked a path down his weathered cheek. He reached out a trembling hand, not to Elizabeth, but to Catherine. A silent plea. "It's okay, Dad," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her own face. "She's here. She's safe. And Mom always loved her." Richard's grip on Catherine's hand remained firm. He looked at Elizabeth again, a long expression. Assessing gaze, then a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a full conversation, not a complete reckoning, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, a fragile moment of clarity that shattered the silence of decades. In that moment, Richard, burdened by his illness, had finally, however briefly, been released from his secret. He recognized his daughter, he recognized his guilt, and perhaps, in that fleeting moment, he found a sliver of peace. The next few months were a journey of rebuilding and discovery. Catherine and Elizabeth, having found each other, were inseparable. They spent hours talking, laughing, sharing stories, each discovery deepening their bond. Elizabeth was welcomed into Catherine's circle of friends, who, though initially surprised, embraced her with warmth and curiosity. Uncle Robert visited, sharing more anecdotes, filling in the gaps of their fragmented family history. They visited Eleanor's grave together, Catherine and Elizabeth. They stood there, side by side, two sisters finally united, sharing stories of their mother, of the woman who had carried so much sorrow, but also so much love. They spoke of Elizabeth's life, of her journey to find them, of the answers Eleanor had so desperately longed for. It was a moment of profound peace, a quiet completion of a circle that had been broken for too long. Catherine, the writer, found her words again. But this time, they flowed not from a place of isolation, but from a profound connection. She began to write about her family's story, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the complex, often painful, path to truth and healing. She wanted Eleanor's story, Elizabeth's story, their collective story, to be heard, to finally break the cycle of silence. Elizabeth's art began to reflect her newfound understanding, her ceramics taking on deeper, more complex forms, infused with both sorrow and a vibrant sense of belonging. She was no longer just an artist searching for her past. She was an artist grounded in her history, enriched by her origins. The old family home in Oakland, once a vault of secrets, now felt different. The air was lighter, filled with a sense of quiet joy and acceptance. The ghosts of the past were not gone. But they were no longer menacing. They were understood, honored, and finally at peace. Richard's condition continued its slow decline, but occasionally, in a moment of lucidity, his eyes would find Elizabeth across the room, and a flicker of the old recognition would return, a gentle, knowing glance. It was a silent conversation, a profound acknowledgement of the daughter he had lost and found again. Catherine and Elizabeth, sisters finally united, learned to navigate the complexities of their unique relationship. They found comfort in their shared features, their similar laugh, the subtle ways their minds worked alike. They were two halves of a whole, brought together by a cruel twist of fate and the tireless search for truth. Their mother's longing, her silent sorrow, had finally found its resolution. The sister who never was had finally come home, and in her presence, the echo of oblivion was replaced by the vibrant chorus of a family, finally, truly complete.